poor mechanic repaired a traveler's bike, unaware she was a billionaire seeking true freedom in life. The open road stretched endlessly before her, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the horizon. The rhythmic hum of her motorcycle was the only sound that accompanied her, steady, predictable, a stark contrast to the chaos she had left behind. Isabel Munro had spent her entire life running from expectations, running from a life that had never truly felt like her own, running from the suffocating weight of a last name that meant power, privilege, and a future she had never chosen. But she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to break down in a town so small it barely had a name. She hadn't expected a man like Gideon Hale, a man who lived simply, worked with his hands, and seemed utterly unaffected by the kind of life she had come from. And she certainly hadn't expected that, for the first time in her life, she might want to stop running. But that's the thing about fate. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It just happens. And sometimes the road you think is leading you nowhere is actually the one taking you exactly where you need to be. Before we begin, if you love stories that make you feel something real, that remind you of the power of love, of second chances, and of finding home in unexpected places, then you won't want to miss this one. Hit subscribe and stay with me as we unravel a love story that proves happiness doesn't have to be grand. It just has to be real. Now let's begin. The sun hung low over Willow Creek, painting the sky in streaks of amber and gold. When Gideon Hale heard it, a low, throaty rumble slicing through the quiet hum of his garage. He wiped his grease-streaked hands on a rag, squinting out from under the hood of a beat-up Ford pickup. The sound grew louder, insistent, until a Harley-Davidson rolled into view, kicking up dust along the cracked asphalt of Route 12. It wasn't the bike that caught his eye, though. It was the rider. She swung a leg over the saddle with a grace that didn't match her faded jeans or the scuffed leather jacket clinging to her frame. The engine coughed once, twice, then died with a pitiful wheeze. She pulled off her helmet, shaking out a cascade of honey-blonde hair that shimmered in the late afternoon light. Dark sunglasses hid her eyes, but her lips curved into a faint, tired smile as she approached. "Afternoon," she said, her voice smooth but edged with something. Exhaustion, maybe, or relief. "My bike's acting up. Think you can take a look?" Gideon straightened, brushing a lock of dark hair from his forehead. At 42, he'd seen his share of stranded travelers pass through this sleepy Nebraska town, but none quite like her. She carried herself with an air of quiet confidence, like she'd ridden out of a story he hadn't yet read. He nodded toward the Harley. "Bring it in. Let's see what's wrong." She wheeled the bike into the shade of his garage, the clink of her boots on the concrete floor, mingling with the distant chirp of crickets. Up close, he caught the scent of leather and something faintly floral. Jasmine, maybe. He knelt beside the Harley, running a hand over the engine. "Sounds like a fuel line issue. I can fix it, but parts might take a couple days to get here. Where you headed in such a hurry?" Her smile flickered, uncertain. "Nowhere special, just riding, seeing where the road takes me." Gideon raised an eyebrow but didn't press. People lied to him all the time, about their cars, their lives. He'd learned to let it slide. "Suit yourself. You're welcome to wait it out in town. Maggie's got rooms above the cafe if you need a place." She nodded, slipping off her sunglasses to reveal eyes the color of a storm-swept sea, blue-green and deep enough to drown in. "Thanks. I'll figure something out." She hesitated, then added, "I'm Isabel, by the way." Gideon Hale. He offered a calloused hand, and hers met it, surprisingly soft but firm. A jolt ran through him, unbidden, and he pulled back, busying himself with the bike. "I'll get started. You want a lemonade while you wait? It's hot as blazes out there." Her face brightened, a real smile this time. "That'd be nice." "Thank you." He fetched a glass from the dented fridge in the corner, pouring from a pitcher he'd made that morning. It was a small thing, a habit he'd picked up from his mother: offer a cold drink to anyone who crossed your path on a summer day. Kindness didn't cost much, she'd say. He handed it to Isabel, and she took it with a murmured thanks, sipping. As she watched him work, the silence between them wasn't awkward. Not exactly. It was the kind that settled over two people who didn't need to fill it with noise. Gideon popped the Harley's fuel cap, his fingers moving with the ease of a man who'd spent half his life under engines. But his mind wandered. There was something about her, a stillness that didn't match the roar of that bike. He glanced at her saddlebag, catching a glint of metal peeking out. A luggage tag, engraved with "I am" in elegant script. His gut twisted. Initials didn't mean much, but they hinted at a story she wasn't telling. "You ride long to get here?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. She shrugged, swirling the ice in her glass. "Long enough. Needed a break from everything." He grunted, recognizing the dodge. He'd been there himself, running from ghosts, hiding in plain sight. 12 years ago he'd come to Willow Creek to escape the wreckage of a broken engagement. Laurie, his ex, had traded him for a banker with a bigger wallet and a shinier life. The betrayal had carved a hollow in him, one he'd filled with oil and steel instead of trust. Now, at 42, he was content enough. Alone, but not lonely. Or so he told himself. Isabel set the glass down on a workbench, empty now, and stood. "I'll let you get to it. Thanks for the drink and the help." "Any time," he said, meaning it more than he expected. She grabbed her helmet and headed out, the sway of her jacket catching the last rays of sunlight. He watched her go, then turned back to the bike, his fingers brushing that luggage tag again. "I am." Who was she, really? An hour later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Gideon locked up the garage and walked the half-mile to Maggie's cafe. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, the smell of coffee and fried onions wrapping around him like a hug. Maggie, 60 and wiry as a fence post, waved from behind the counter. "Usual, Gideon?" "Yeah, thanks." He slid into a booth, then froze. There, wiping down a table in a borrowed apron, was Isabel. She caught his eye and grinned, sheepish but warm. "Needed something to do," she said, shrugging. "Maggie's letting me pitch in." Maggie chuckled, sliding a plate of meatloaf in front of him. "Girls are natural. Already got ideas to spruce up my menu." Gideon took a bite, hiding a smile. Isabel didn't belong here, not with that bike, those initials, that mystery in her eyes. But as she laughed at something Maggie said, wiping her hands on that apron, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't in years. Curiosity, maybe, or hope. Outside, the crickets sang louder, and the night settled over Willow Creek like a promise. Gideon didn't know it yet, but the stranger on the Harley had just shifted the gears of his quiet life, and the road ahead would be anything but straight. The next morning broke over Willow Creek with a chorus of birdsong and the faint clatter of dishes from Maggie's cafe. Isabel Monroe stood behind the counter, her borrowed apron dusted with flour, pouring coffee for old man Tanner with a smile that felt more natural than it had in years. She'd slept fitfully in the narrow bed above the cafe, the hum of the Harley's dying engine still echoing in her mind. But here, in this sleepy town, the weight of her old life, of boardrooms and ballrooms, felt a little lighter. Maggie bustled out from the kitchen, her grey hair pulled into a loose bun, wiping her hands on a towel. "You're a godsend, Isabel," she said, eyeing the steady stream of regulars. "Never seen Tanner tip before. What's your secret?" Isabel laughed, soft and unguarded. "Just listen to him grumble about the weather. People like to be heard, I guess." Maggie nodded, her sharp eyes softening. "You've got a way about you. Ever think of staying put?" The question caught Isabel off guard, her hand pausing mid-pour. Staying put wasn't an option, not with her family's private investigators probably combing the country for her by now. She'd left New York 3 weeks ago, her sleek BMW traded for that Harley, her tailored suits swapped for denim and leather. She was Isabel Monroe, heiress to the Monroe Hotel empire, but here she was, just Isabel, pouring coffee and dodging questions. "Maybe for a day or two," she said, forcing a grin, "till my bike's ready." Across town, Gideon Hale hunched over the Harley in his garage, the morning sun slanting through the open door. He'd found the problem, a clogged fuel line, just as he'd suspected, but he was taking his time. Something about Isabel nagged at him, like a tune he couldn't place. That luggage tag, "I am," glinted in his memory. He shook it off, focusing on the engine, but her face, those sea-storm eyes, kept drifting into his thoughts. By noon, the cafe was buzzing. Isabel had scribbled a recipe for a peach cobbler on a napkin, tweaking Maggie's usual pie lineup, and the first batch sold out in an hour. Customers lingered, chatting over extra slices, and Maggie's cash register sang a happier tune than it had in months. Isabel wiped down a table, her sleeves rolled up, feeling a quiet pride she hadn't known in years. Back home, success meant mergers and millions. Here, it was a warm plate and a stranger's smile. She didn't notice Gideon slip in until he was there, leaning against the counter with a grease-smudged rag in his hand. "Bike's coming along," he said, his voice low and steady. "Thought you might want to know." Isabel straightened, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Thanks. You didn't have to come tell me." He shrugged, a flicker of a smile, tugging at his lips. "Maggie's coffee's better than mine, and I figured you'd be here stirring up trouble." "Trouble?" She arched a brow, playful. "I prefer to call it progress." Maggie chimed in, sliding a mug toward Gideon. "She's a keeper, this one. Got my regulars eating out of her hand." Gideon took the coffee, his hazel eyes meeting Isabel's for a beat longer than necessary. "I can see that. The air between them shifted, warm and charged, but he broke it first, sipping his coffee and turning toward the window. Isabel watched him, curious. He was all edges, broad shoulders, calloused hands, a jaw set like he'd fought the world and won. But there was a gentleness there, too, in the way he'd offered her that lemonade yesterday, in the way he didn't push her for answers. Later, as the afternoon faded into a golden haze, Isabel borrowed a rusty bicycle from Maggie's shed and pedaled out of town. The wind tugged at her hair, and for the first time in weeks, she felt untethered. No emails, no expectations, just the open road and the promise of a quiet evening. She found herself at a meadow, the grass swaying under a sky streaked with pink. She parked the bike and sat, knees drawn up, letting the stillness settle over her. Footsteps crunched behind her, and she turned to see Gideon, a fishing pole slung over his shoulder. He froze, clearly as surprised as she was. "Didn't expect company?" he said, nodding toward the pond glimmering nearby. "Mind if I join you?" She shook her head, patting the grass beside her. "Plenty of room." He settled in, casting his line with a practiced flick, the silence stretched, comfortable, until he spoke. "You ever fish?" "Not since I was a kid," she said, her voice softening with memory. "My dad used to take me. Before everything got complicated." Gideon glanced at her, his gaze steady. "Complicated how?" She hesitated, then dodged. "Just life. You know how it goes." She pointed at the sky instead. "Look at that. You don't get stars like this in the city." He followed her gaze, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Yeah, out here they're close enough to touch. Makes you feel small, but not in a bad way." They sat there, the pond rippling softly, the stars blinking awake one by one. Isabel stole a glance at him, his profile sharp against the dusk, his hands resting easy on the pole. He wasn't like the men she'd known, all polish and ambition. He was real, grounded, and it stirred something in her she couldn't name. Back at the cafe that night, Maggie pulled Gideon aside as Isabel cleared tables. She reminds me of my Sarah, Maggie whispered, her voice thick. My girl who left years ago, same fire, same heart. Don't let her slip away without a fight, Gideon. He frowned, sipping his coffee. She's just passing through, Mags. Maggie's eyes narrowed. Maybe, but I've seen the way you look at her, like she's waking something up in you. Gideon didn't answer, but Maggie's words stuck, sharp and true. He finished his coffee and stepped outside, the night air cool against his skin. Across the street, Isabel laughed with a customer through the cafe window, her apron smudged with peach juice, her smile bright enough to rival the stars. He didn't know her story, not yet, but he felt it, deep in his bones. She was more than a stranger on a Harley, and maybe, just maybe, she was here to stay. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over Willow Creek, gilding the pond where Gideon Hale stood, fishing pole in hand. 3 days had passed since Isabel Munro rolled into town, and though he'd never admit it aloud, her presence had stirred something in him, a restlessness he hadn't felt since the days when love still seemed possible. He'd kept his distance mostly, tinkering with her Harley in the garage, but today he'd acted on impulse. Fishing tomorrow? He'd asked her at the cafe that morning, casual as if it didn't matter. She'd grinned and said yes, and now here they were. Isabel sat on the bank beside him, her jeans rolled up to her calves, bare feet dangling over the water's edge. She held a borrowed pole, its line bobbing lazily in the pond. The air smelled of damp earth and honeysuckle, and a breeze rustled the cottonwoods, carrying the faint hum of crickets. She looked at ease, her blonde hair catching the light, but Gideon sensed a current beneath her calm, something unspoken, like a storm waiting to break. "Caught anything yet?" she asked, her voice teasing as she nudged him with her elbow. He smirked, reeling in his empty line. "Not a nibble, fish must have heard you coming." She laughed, bright and unguarded, and the sound loosened something in his chest. He'd forgotten what it felt like to share a moment like this, simple, unburdened. For years he'd lived in the shadow of Laurie's betrayal, her voice still sharp in his memory. "You're not enough, Gideon. I need more." She'd left him for a slick banker from Omaha, and he'd buried the hurt under layers of grease and solitude. At 42, he'd convinced himself he didn't need anyone. Until now. He cast his line again, then glanced at Isabel. "You said your dad took you fishing. What was he like?" Her smile faded, softening into something wistful. She stared at the water, her fingers tightening on the pole. "He was steady, taught me how to tie a lure, how to wait out a catch. He ran a business, big one, but he always made time for me. Then he got sick, and everything changed." She paused, her voice dropping. "I lost him when I was 20. After that, it was just me and the family machine." Gideon nodded, recognizing the weight of loss in her words. "Sounds like he was a good man." He was. She met his eyes, hers shimmering with an old ache. "What about you? Who taught you to fish?" "My old man," he said, his tone gruff but warm. "He'd drag me out here every summer till I could bait a hook blindfolded. Died when I was 16, left me this pole and a lot of quiet." Isabel tilted her head, studying him. "Quiet's not so bad, but it can get heavy, can't it?" "Yeah," he admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "It can." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, woven with the rustle of leaves and the lap of water against the bank. Gideon felt her presence beside him, steady and real, and for the first time in years he wanted to peel back the layers he'd built around himself. He cleared his throat, his voice low. "Ever have someone break your heart so bad you stop believing it's worth the risk?" She turned to him, her gaze piercing. "Once. But it wasn't a lover. It was family. Expectations that choke you, till there's nothing left." She hesitated, then added, "What about you? Who broke yours?" He stared at the pond, the memory rising like a ghost. "Her name was Laurie. We were engaged. Thought we'd build a life, kids, a house, the whole deal. Then she found someone with deeper pockets. Left me standing in a church parking lot with a ring I couldn't return. He chuckled, dry and bitter. Haven't trusted my heart since. Isabel didn't flinch, didn't offer pity. She just nodded, slow and thoughtful. Sometimes people hurt us because they're lost too. Doesn't make it right, but it's not always about us. Her words landed soft but sharp, cutting through the armor he'd worn so long it felt like skin. He looked at her, really looked, past the denim and the bravado, and saw a woman who'd been bruised by life too. "You sound like you've figured that out the hard way," he said. "Maybe I have." She smiled faintly, then cast her line. Again, the motion graceful and sure. "But I'm still here, fishing with a stranger. That's something." "Not a stranger anymore," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Her eyes flicked to his, warm and searching, and for a moment the world shrank to just the two of them, two souls on a quiet bank, tethered by a thread neither could name. Then a fish tugged her line and she yelped, scrambling to reel it in. Gideon laughed, deep and real, helping her haul up a wriggling base. They cheered like kids, their hands brushing as they freed the hook, and the touch lingered, electric and unspoken. Back at the garage that evening, Gideon couldn't shake her. He locked up, the Harley gleaming in the corner, nearly fixed but not quite. He didn't want it done. Not yet. In his cramped apartment above the shop, he dug through a box in the closet, pulling out a faded photo, him and Laurie, smiling at a county fair. Her betrayal had defined him for too long. He stared at it, then carried it to the kitchen, lit a match, and watched it curl into ash in the sink. The smoke stung his eyes, but the weight in his chest felt lighter. As the ashes settled, he thought of Isabel, of her laugh, her quiet strength, the way she'd listened without judgment. She'd slipped up by the pond, mentioning a family machine, then clammed up fast. It didn't add up, not with her worn clothes and that beat-up bike. Who was she, really? The question gnawed at him, but so did something else. A flicker of trust, fragile and new, daring him to believe again. Outside, the stars burned bright over Willow Creek, and Gideon wondered if maybe, just maybe, the past didn't have to own him anymore. The annual Willow Creek Fair buzzed with life under a sky streaked with cotton candy clouds, the air thick with the scent of popcorn and grilled corn. Gideon Hale stood near the dunk tank, his sleeves rolled up, helping little Tommy Jenkins fix a toy tractor that had lost a wheel. At 42, he'd never been one for crowds, but the fair was tradition, a heartbeat that pulsed through this town every summer, drawing folks together like family. This year, though, it felt different. Isabel Monroe was here. She'd come with him, almost by accident. He'd mentioned the fair over coffee at Maggie's that morning, a throwaway line. "Gets busy tonight if you're around." And she'd lit up, saying, "I wouldn't miss it." Now she moved through the crowd like she belonged. Her denim jacket swapped for a borrowed sundress from Maggie's closet, her blonde hair loose and catching the evening light. Gideon watched her from the corner of his eye, a warmth spreading in his chest he didn't quite trust. Isabel stopped at the bake sale booth, her peach cobbler from the cafe displayed front and center. She'd insisted on entering it in the contest, and when the judge, a stout woman named Clara with a no-nonsense glare, declared it the winner, the crowd cheered. Isabel beamed, her sea storm eyes sparkling, and Gideon couldn't help but smile. She didn't keep the prize, a $20 gift card to the hardware store. Instead, she slipped it to the Hendersons, a young couple with a toddler and a leaking roof, whispering, "You need this more." The gesture was quiet, unshowy, and it hit Gideon square in the gut. "You're good at this," he said later, finding her near the Ferris wheel, its lights twinkling against the dusk. "At what?" She tilted her head, a teasing lilt in her voice. "Making people like you." He nodded toward the Hendersons, who were thanking her again across the midway. "Not everyone would have done that," she shrugged, brushing it off. "It's just a gift card. Besides, I've had enough prizes in my life." There it was again, a hint of something bigger, something she kept locked away. Gideon wanted to ask, to pry open that door she guarded so carefully, but the band struck up a slow tune and the moment slipped away. Couples drifted to the makeshift dance floor, a patch of grass ringed with hay bales. Isabel glanced at him, a playful challenge in her eyes. "You dance, Gideon Hale?" "Not if I can help it," he said, but his feet were already moving toward her. She laughed, taking his hand, and they stepped into the sway of the music, a country ballad about love and second chances. His hand settled on her waist, hers on his shoulder, and the world blurred around them. She smelled of peaches and summer, and her touch was light but sure, pulling him closer than he'd meant to get. For 3 minutes, under the glow of string lights, Gideon forgot the scars Laurie had left, forgot the walls he'd built. Isabel looked up at him, her lips parting as if to speak, and he wondered what it'd be like to kiss her, right there in the heart of Willow Creek. The song ended too soon, applause breaking the spell. They stepped apart, breathless, and Gideon rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly awkward. "Not bad for a guy with 2 left feet." "Not bad at all," she said, her smile soft and lingering. They wandered toward the game booths, the moment still humming between them, when a stranger caught Gideon's eye, a wiry man in a cheap suit, snapping photos with a camera that didn't fit the fair's small-town vibe. He aimed the lens at Isabel, muttering something into a phone. Gideon's gut tightened. "Friend of yours?" he asked, nodding toward the man. Isabel followed his gaze, and her face paled, just for a second, before she masked it with a shrug. Never seen him, probably just a tourist. But Gideon wasn't so sure. The man lingered, his eyes tracking Isabel as she tossed a ring at a bottle and missed, laughing. Gideon heard him murmur, "Missing heiress, jackpot," before slipping into the crowd. The words landed like a stone in Gideon's chest. "Heiress." He glanced at Isabel, her laughter ringing out, and the pieces didn't fit. Not yet. But doubt crept in, cold and familiar, whispering memories of Laurie's lies. Back at Maggie's cafe later, the fair's glow fading into night, Gideon nursed a coffee while Isabel helped Maggie close up. The place was empty, the jukebox silent, and Maggie left a tabloid on the counter, a gossip rag someone had dropped. Gideon flipped it open, more out of habit than interest, until a headline stopped him cold. "Hotel heiress Isabel Monroe vanishes. Family offers reward." Below it, a grainy photo of a woman in a sleek gown, blonde hair swept up, eyes unmistakable. His coffee went bitter in his mouth. He looked up, watching Isabel wipe down the counter, her movements easy and unhurried. The woman in the photo was polished, untouchable, a far cry from the one humming a tune in Maggie's apron. But those eyes... He folded the paper, tucking it under his arm, and slipped out before she noticed. The night air hit him hard, sharp with questions he wasn't ready to ask. Back at his garage, Gideon sat on the stool by the Harley, the tabloid open in front of him. Isabel Monroe, billionaire's daughter, runaway heiress. The luggage tag, a beak flashed in his mind, and Laurie's voice echoed, "You're not enough." Was this another game? Another woman slumming it until something better came along? He traced the photo with a grease-stained finger, his heart warring with his head. She'd danced with him, given away her prize, listened to his pain by the pond. That wasn't fake. Was it? Outside, the fair's distant music faded, and Willow Creek settled into sleep. Gideon didn't know what to believe, but one thing was clear. Isabel wasn't just passing through anymore. She'd woven herself into this town, into him, and whatever truth she was hiding, it was coming closer every day. The morning after the fair dawned gray and heavy over Willow Creek, the sky bruised with clouds that mirrored the storm brewing in Gideon Hale's chest. He stood in his garage, the Harley-Davidson gleaming under the fluorescent lights, its fuel. Line fixed and ready. He should have been relieved, job done, another traveler sent on their way. But the tabloid from last night sat on his workbench, its headline screaming, Hotel heiress Isabel Munro vanishes. He'd barely slept. The photo of her polished, distant self warring with the Isabel he knew, the one who'd danced with him under string lights, who'd given away her prize with a shy smile. He heard her boots on the concrete before he saw her, the familiar clink pulling him from his thoughts. Isabel stepped into the garage, her denim jacket slung over one shoulder, her hair loose and wind-tousled. "Morning," she said, her voice bright but cautious. "Bike ready?" Gideon nodded, wiping his hands on a rag to hide the tremor in them. "Yeah, good as new." He gestured to the Harley, then hesitated, the tabloid burning a hole in his periphery. He couldn't dodge it anymore. He grabbed the paper and held it up, his voice low and tight. "This you?" Her eyes widened, flickering to the headline, then back to him. For a moment she was still, too still, like a deer caught in headlights. Then she exhaled, slow and shaky, and nodded. "Yeah, that's me." The air thickened, the hum of the garage fan suddenly loud. Gideon's jaw clenched. "Isabel Munro, hotel heiress, billionaire's daughter, that what you've been hiding." She stepped closer, her hands raised as if to steady him, or herself. "Gideon, I didn't lie to you, not really, I needed to get away, from all of it." "Away?" He tossed the tabloid onto the workbench, his voice rising despite himself. "You've been pouring coffee, fishing with me, acting like some drifter, and you're what? A runaway princess. Was this a game to you, slumming it with the small-town mechanic?" Her face crumpled, hurt flashing in those sea-storm eyes. "No, it was never a game. This—" She gestured around the garage, then to him. "This was real, the first real, a thing I've had in years." "Then why not tell me?" he snapped, the old ache of Laurie's betrayal clawing up his throat. "I opened up to you, told you things I don't tell anyone, and you've been sitting on a secret like this?" "I wanted to," she said, her voice breaking, "but every time I tried, I couldn't. I didn't want you to look at me like you are now, like I'm someone else." "Maybe you are," he shot back, turning away to grip the edge of the workbench. His knuckles whitened, the sting of doubt cutting deep. "I've been down this road before, Isabel. Someone pretending to be one thing, then walking away when the truth comes out." She flinched, but her voice steadied. "I'm not her, Gideon. I'm not Laurie. I stayed because I found something here. Peace, purpose, you. My family wants me back in New York. Married off to some suit to save their empire. I ran because I couldn't breathe there." He turned, meeting her gaze, and saw the raw truth in it. No polish, no pretense. But the hurt in him wouldn't bend. "You've got a whole world waiting for you. I'm just a guy with a wrench. What happens when you get tired of this?" "I won't," she said, stepping closer, her eyes pleading. "I swear I won't." Before he could answer, a sleek black SUV rolled up outside, its tinted windows glinting like a predator's eyes. A man in a crisp suit stepped out, his polished shoes absurd against the dusty gravel. "Miss Munro," he called, his tone clipped. "Your family's been worried. Time to come home." Gideon's stomach dropped. Isabel froze, her breath hitching. "I'm not going," she said, but the man advanced, his hand on a phone already buzzing with authority. "Your father's offering a generous reward," the man said, glancing at Gideon with cold appraisal. "And Mr. Grayson's waiting." "The engagement's set." "Grayson," Gideon echoed, the name a punch to his gut. "You're engaged." "No," Isabel said, whirling to him. "It's arranged. I don't want it. I never did. Gideon, please." But he stepped back, the walls he'd let crack slamming shut. "Sounds like you've got a life to get back to. Don't let me keep you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't fight him. She grabbed her helmet, her movements jerky, and faced the investigator. "Tell them I'll call. I need a minute." He nodded, retreating to the SUV, and she turned to Gideon one last time. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you, but what we had, it was real. I hope you believe that someday." She walked out, leaving a folded note on the Harley's seat. Gideon didn't move until the SUV's engine faded into the distance, the silence swallowing him whole. He picked up the note, her handwriting shaky but clear. "I found myself here. Thank you." He sank onto a stool, the words blurring as his chest tightened. She was gone, and he'd pushed her away. Just like he'd pushed everyone since. Laurie. But this felt different. Her tears, her voice, they'd cut deeper than he'd expected. Later, at Maggie's cafe, he slid into a booth, the note crumpled in his pocket. Maggie set a coffee in front of him, her eyes sharp. "Saw that fancy car. She's gone, huh?" "Yeah," he muttered, staring into the black liquid. Maggie leaned in, her voice low. "I knew who she was, Gideon. Found that tabloid days ago. Didn't say anything because she's good people. Lost, maybe, but good. You should have heard her out." He looked up, startled. "You knew." "Figured it out," she said, tapping the counter. "She's running from a cage, not a crown. And you just locked her back in it." The words hit like a slap, and Gideon's throat burned. He'd seen the fear in Isabel's eyes, the plea, and he'd turned away. Maggie was right. He'd judged her by Laurie's shadow, not her own light. But it was too late now, wasn't it? Outside, the clouds broke, rain tapping the cafe windows like a quiet apology. Gideon clutched the note, her gratitude searing into him, and wondered if he'd just lost something he didn't know how to name. The days after Isabel's departure stretched long and hollow over Willow Creek, the grey skies bleeding into Gideon Hale's mood. His garage felt too big without her Harley rumbling in the corner, its absence a silent rebuke. He threw himself into work, tune-ups, oil changes, a busted carburetor from Old Man Tanner's truck, but his hands moved on autopilot, his mind circling back to her. That note. "I found myself here. Thank you." Sat folded in his pocket, its edges worn. From restless fingers, he hadn't burned it like he had Laurie's photo. He couldn't. At 42, Gideon had mastered the art of solitude, turning it into a shield against the world. Laurie's betrayal had taught him that. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. But Isabel had slipped past that shield. Her laugh, echoing in the garage, her touch lingering from that dance at the fair. Now she was gone, back to a life he couldn't fathom, and he'd pushed her out the door. The ache in his chest wasn't anger anymore, it was regret, sharp and unyielding. He avoided Maggie's cafe for 2 days, knowing her sharp eyes would see right through him. But by Wednesday, hunger and habit won out. The bell jingled as he stepped inside, the smell of coffee and fried eggs wrapping around him like an old friend. Maggie glanced up from the counter, her grey bun askew, and slid a mug his way without a word. Isabel's absence hung heavy, the counter where she'd hummed while wiping it down, the booth where she'd laughed with customers. It was all wrong without her. "You look like a man who's lost his best wrench," Maggie said, leaning on her elbows. "Gonna tell me what's eating you, or do I have to guess?" Gideon sipped his coffee, the bitterness matching his mood. "She's gone, Mags. That's all there is to it." Maggie snorted, unimpressed. "Gone don't mean lost. You sent her packing, Gideon. Big difference." He bristled, but her words stuck. "She's a billionaire's daughter, engaged to some hotshot. What was I supposed to do? Beg her to stay in this nowhere town?" "You could have listened," Maggie said, her voice softening. "She wasn't Laurie, running off for a better deal. She was scared, trapped. I lost my Sarah to pride, didn't fight when she walked away. Don't you make the same mistake." Gideon stared into his mug, Maggie's story cutting deeper than he'd expected. Sarah, her daughter, had left years ago after a fight Maggie wouldn't talk about. He'd never pressed, but now the parallel stung. "It's too late," he muttered. "She's back in her world now." Maggie tapped the counter firm. "Maybe, but I saw how she looked at you. That girl found something here worth keeping. Question is, did you?" He didn't answer, but her words burrowed in, stirring the embers of doubt. Back at the garage, he pulled the Harley's keys from a drawer, the metal cold against his palm. She hadn't taken it, said she'd send for it later. He climbed on, fired it up, and rode out of town, the wind whipping past him like a memory of her. He ended up at the pond, the same spot where they'd fished, where she'd listened to his past without judgment. The water rippled under a slate grey sky, and he replayed her voice. Sometimes people hurt us because they're lost too. Had he hurt her the same way? He parked the bike and sat on the bank, the grass damp beneath him. The silence pressed in, broken only by the rustle of leaves. He pulled her note from his pocket, reading it again. And something shifted, a crack in the wall he'd rebuilt too fast. She'd thanked him, even after he'd turned her away. That wasn't Laurie. That was Isabel, real, raw, and gone because he hadn't believed in her. That night he flipped on the ancient TV in his apartment, more for noise than interest. A news channel flickered to life, and there she was, Isabel, radiant in a white gown at some glitzy New York event. The ticker read, "Monroe heiress resurfaces at engagement gala." Her fiancé, a slick man with a shark smile, stood beside her, but her eyes were hollow, her smile a mask. Gideon's stomach twisted. She didn't look free. She looked caged. He shut off the TV, the image searing into him. He'd assumed she'd run back to her old life, eager to slip into that gown. But those eyes told a different story, one he'd refused to hear. Maggie's voice echoed. She was trapped. He paced the small room, the Harley's keys, jangling in his hand, when a knock startled him. It was Tommy Jenkins, the kid from the fair, clutching a letter. "Miss Maggie said to give you this," Tommy mumbled, then darted off. Gideon tore it open, his breath catching. It was from Isabel, left with Maggie before she'd gone. Her handwriting was hurried but clear. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I was afraid you'd see me as the heiress, not me. You gave me a taste of real, fishing, laughing, just being. I'll never forget that. Forgive me if you can." Tucked inside was a sketch, pencil lines of them by the pond, his profile sharp, her smile soft. It was rough but alive, capturing a moment he'd buried. He sank onto the couch, the sketch trembling in his hands. She'd seen him, really seen him, and he'd pushed her away, blinded by old ghosts. The TV's silence roared now, her hollow eyes haunting him. He'd been wrong. She hadn't left because she wanted to. She'd left because he'd given her no reason to stay. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the garage below. Gideon clutched the letter, Maggie's warning ringing in his ears. "Don't make the same mistake." He didn't know if he could fix this, didn't know if she'd even want him to. But as the night deepened, one truth settled in his bones. Isabel Monroe had changed him, and letting her go without a fight wasn't who he wanted to be anymore. The dawn broke cold and clear over Willow Creek, frost glazing the garage windows as Gideon Hale stood beside his vintage Triumph motorcycle. It was a 1972 Bonneville, all chrome and grit, the last piece of his father he'd held on to through the years. He ran a hand over its curves, the metal icy under his palm, and felt the weight of what he was about to do. Isabel's letter lay on the workbench, her sketch of them by the pond pinned beneath a wrench. Those pencil lines, his profile, her smile, had haunted him all night, whispering a truth he couldn't ignore. He'd let her go, but he didn't have to let her stay gone. At 42, Gideon had spent too long hiding from risk, letting Laurie's betrayal define him. But Isabel wasn't Laurie. Her note, her hollow eyes on that TV screen, they'd cracked something open in him, a longing he'd buried under grease and solitude. He couldn't fix the past, but he could fight for this, for her. New York was 1,000 miles away, a world he didn't know, but he'd sell the Triumph, buy a bus ticket, and find her. Not to drag her back, but to give her a choice he'd stolen away. He hauled the bike to Hank's auto shop down the road, the only place in town that'd give him a fair price. Hank, a wiry man with a smoker's rasp, whistled low. "You sure?" About this, Gideon, this beauty's been with you forever. Sure as I've ever been, Gideon said, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. Need the cash. Got somewhere to be. Hank scratched his beard, then nodded. 1,500, best I can do. It was enough. Gideon shook his hand, signed the papers, and walked away with a wad of bills and a hollow space where the triumph had been. He didn't look back, couldn't. At the garage, he packed a duffel with a change of clothes and Isabel's letter, then headed to the bus station, a squat building on the edge of town. The ticket to New York cost him half the sale, but he didn't flinch. He'd figure out the rest when he got there. The bus rolled out at noon, a lumbering beast of faded seats and diesel fumes. Gideon settled by a window, the Nebraska plains, blurring past in streaks of brown and gold. He'd never left Willow Creek for more than a day trip, never had a reason to. Now he was chasing a woman he barely knew, armed with nothing but a hunch and a note. It felt reckless, foolish even, but it also felt right. An hour in, an elderly woman slid into the seat beside him, her silver hair tucked under a knit cap. She smelled of lavender and carried a worn paperback, Love in the Time of Cholera. "Where you headed, son?" she asked, her voice creaky but kind. "New York," Gideon said, shifting to give her room. "Got someone to see." She smiled, her eyes crinkling. "A lady, I'll bet. Only love makes a man look that determined." He chuckled, dry but genuine, something like that. Her name was Evelyn, a retired librarian from Lincoln, and she filled the miles with stories, of books, of her late husband, of a life stitched with quiet joys and regrets. Gideon listened, half distracted, until she said, "I lost my Tom too. Soon. Waited too long to tell him I loved him. Don't wait for tomorrow, young man. It's not promised." Her words landed heavy, echoing Maggie's warning, and Gideon nodded, throat tight. "I won't." By dusk, the bus stopped at a gas station in Illinois, the sky a bruise of purple and orange. Evelyn rummaged in her purse, then pressed a paper into his hand. "Backstage pass to the Ritz-Carlton in New York," she said with a wink. "My Tom was a journalist, covered the fancy folks. Expired years ago, but security's lazy. Might get you close to your girl." Gideon stared at the pass, its edges yellowed but the seal intact. "How'd you—" "Call it a hunch," she said, patting his arm. "You've got the look of a man who needs a miracle." He thanked her, tucking the pass into his pocket with Isabel's letter. A retired journalist who knew the ritzy world Isabel came from? The coincidence felt too neat, but he didn't question it. The bus rumbled on, city lights flickering. Into view as night fell, and Gideon pulled out a scrap of paper from his duffel. He scribbled a note, his handwriting rough but sure. "If you're happy, I'll go. If not, I'm waiting where it began." It was simple, maybe too simple, but it was all he had. A promise, not a demand. The hours blurred, the bus weaving through highways and tolls until Manhattan's skyline loomed ahead, a jagged crown of steel and glass. Gideon stepped off. At Port Authority, the air thick with exhaust and noise, his boots scuffing the grimy pavement. He'd never seen anything like it. Willow Creek could fit in one of these blocks, but he squared his shoulders, the pass and note burning in his pocket. The Ritz-Carlton was across town, hosting her engagement gala tomorrow night. According to the news, he'd caught at a diner stop. He'd crash it, slip her the note, and let her choose. No heroics, no grand gestures, just a chance. He found a cheap motel near the station, a dingy room with a sagging bed and a flickering bulb. Sleep wouldn't come, so he sat by the window, watching the city pulse below. Evelyn's voice lingered. "Don't wait for tomorrow." And he thought of Isabel in that white gown, her eyes empty. He'd sold his father's bike, crossed half the country, and staked everything on this. Not because he deserved her, but because she deserved better than a cage. The pass crinkled in his hand, a fragile key to a world he didn't belong in. He didn't know if she'd read the note, didn't know if she'd care, But as the city hummed outside, Gideon felt a quiet fire ignite, one he hadn't known since he was a boy, dreaming of a life beyond the plains. He was here, and he wasn't running anymore. The Ritz-Carlton ballroom shimmered under a sea of chandeliers, crystal, glinting like stars trapped in glass. Isabel Munro stood at its center, a vision in white silk, her gown hugging her frame with an elegance that felt more like chains than couture. The engagement gala swirled around her, clinking champagne flutes, murmured flattery, the weight of 100 eyes, but she was numb to it all. Her fiancé, Edward Grayson, loomed beside her, his hand possessive on her arm, his smile a polished mask for the cameras. She'd been back in New York for 5 days, dragged into this gilded cage by her family's demands, and every breath felt borrowed. At 38, Isabel had spent her life bending to the Munro legacy. Hotels, wealth, a name that opened doors but locked her in. She'd run to Willow Creek to escape it, to taste freedom in dusty air and quiet ponds, but now she was here, playing the part again. Edward droned onto a cluster of investors, his voice abuzz in her ears, and she forced a smile, her eyes scanning the room for an exit she couldn't take. Not yet. Across the city, Gideon Hale stood outside the hotel, his worn jacket out of place among the valets and limos. The backstage pass from Evelyn dangled in his pocket, a fragile hope against the towering glass doors. He'd made it this far, sold his triumph, crossed 1,000 miles, slept in a flea-bitten motel, all for a chance to reach her. The note he'd scribbled on the bus. "If you're happy, I'll go. If not, I'm waiting where it began," felt small in his hand, but it was all he had. He wasn't here to storm in like some movie hero. He just wanted her to know she had a choice. The pass got him through a side entrance, past a bored security guard who barely glanced at the faded seal. Inside, the kitchen buzzed, clattering pans, shouted orders, and Gideon slipped through, his boots silent on the tile. A waiter, a kid with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, eyed him curiously. "You lost?" "Man!" Gideon held up the note, his voice steady. "Need this delivered. To Isabel Munro. Can you do it?" The kid hesitated, then shrugged. "Sure, she's out there with the big shots. Give me a sec." He took the note and vanished through the swinging doors, leaving Gideon in the shadows, heart pounding like a piston. Back in the ballroom, Isabel felt the night closing in. Edward's grip tightened as he introduced her to another suit, his words dripping with ownership. "My future wife, the jewel of the Munro Empire." She nodded, her smile brittle when the waiter appeared, slipping her a folded scrap of paper. She tucked it into her palm, her pulse quickening, and excused herself to the powder room, Edward's frown trailing her like a shadow. In the marble quiet, she unfolded it, and Gideon's rough scrawl hit her like a gust of Willow Creek wind. "If you're happy, I'll go. If not, I'm waiting where it began." Her breath caught, tears pricking her eyes. He was here, in this city of steel and lies, offering her a lifeline she'd thought she'd lost. The memory of his voice by the pond, his hand on hers at the fair, flooded back. And she knew. She wasn't happy. She never would be here. The door creaked open, and Edward's mother, Lillian Grayson, swept in, her silver hair sharp as her tongue. "You're stalling, Isabel," she said, her eyes cold. "Edward's impatient. This merger, your marriage, secures everything." Isabel faced her, the note clutched tight. "And what about me? What do I get?" Lillian's laugh was thin. "Security, status, more than that little town could ever offer." She leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Edward doesn't love you, dear. He loves your name, but you knew that." The words were a slap, but they broke the last thread holding Isabel in place. She'd suspected it, buried it under duty, but hearing it plain stripped away the illusion. She didn't belong. Here, not with Edward, not in this life. She slipped the note into her sleeve and straightened. "I'm done," she said, and brushed past Lillian, her steps quickening. Back in the ballroom, the crowd parted as she moved, Edward's voice calling after her. "Isabel, where are you going?" But she didn't stop. She grabbed a coat from a rack, borrowed a car key from a flustered valet, and ran into the night, the gala's lights fading behind her. The city blurred past, horns, neon, rain-slick streets, as she drove west, her heart pulling her toward Willow Creek, toward Gideon. He'd come for her, and she wouldn't let him wait alone. Meanwhile, Gideon lingered outside, the cold biting through his jacket. The doorman had caught him loitering, barking, "Move along!" And he'd retreated across the street, turned away by guards when he'd tried the front. He'd given her the note, trusted the waiter, but she hadn't. Come out. Maybe she was happy here, he thought, the doubt gnawing at him. Maybe he'd misread everything, but he couldn't stay. He'd promised her a choice, not a scene. He hailed a cab back to Port Authority, then caught a late bus out, heading home. Not to the Ritz, not to New York, but to where it began, the garage in Willow Creek. If she wanted him, she'd know where to find him. He leaned against the bus window, the city receding, and let the rumble carry him away. His faith in her, a quiet ember in the dark. In the borrowed sedan, Isabel sped through the night, the radio crackling with static. She didn't see him outside. The hotel didn't know he'd left, but his note burned in her mind, guiding her back to the dusty road where they'd met. She'd escaped the gala, the cage, the lies, and now she was running toward something real, toward him. The miles stretched ahead, the rain tapping the windshield like a heartbeat. Neither knew the other was moving, but the road was pulling them together, one last time. The rain fell soft and steady over Willow Creek, a gentle drumbeat against the tin roof of Gideon Hale's garage. He stood under the awning, a lantern glowing at his feet, its light pooling in the damp gravel. The bus from New York had dropped him off an hour ago. The long ride back a blur of restless hope and gnawing doubt. He'd slipped Isabel the note at the gala, left it in her hands, and come here, where it began, trusting she'd understand. Now at 42 he waited, his jacket soaked through, his heart a tangle of faith and fear. He'd sold his triumph, crossed 1,000 miles, and stood outside that glittering Ritz-Carlton for her, not to drag her back, but to offer her a choice. Something he'd failed to do when she'd stood in this very garage, pleading with him to believe her. Her letter. "I found myself here. Thank you." And that sketch of them by the pond were tucked in his pocket, worn from his touch. He didn't know if she'd come, didn't know if she'd even read the note, but he'd promised to wait, and he would. The night deepened, the rain a silver curtain across the empty road. Gideon leaned against the wall, the lantern flickering, and thought of her, those sea-storm eyes, her laugh at the fair, the way she'd listened by the pond. He'd pushed her away once, blinded by Laurie's ghost, but this time he'd fought for her in his quiet way. If she chose that life in New York, he'd let her go. But if she didn't, headlights cut through the haze, faint at first, then, growing as a car slowed and stopped, Gideon straightened, his breath catching. The door opened, and Isabel Munro stepped out, soaked to the bone, her white gala gown traded for jeans and a borrowed coat. She stood there, trembling, her blonde hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide and searching. "Gideon," she whispered, barely audible over the rain. He moved toward her, boots crunching on wet gravel, the lantern swinging in his hand. "You're here," he said, his voice rough with relief. I got your note," she cut in, stepping closer, her breath hitching. "I ran. From the gala, from everything. Why didn't you stay? Why didn't you storm in and take me away like in the movies?" He stopped a foot away, rain dripping from his hair, and managed a small, crooked smile. Because I didn't want to take you. I wanted you to run to me, to choose this, us, if it's what you wanted. Her eyes shimmered, tears mingling with the rain, and she laughed, a shaky, beautiful sound. You're impossible, Gideon Hale. Yeah, he said, softer now, but I'm here. She closed the gap, throwing her arms around him, and he caught her, pulling her close. She was cold, trembling, but solid against him, her warmth seeping through the wet fabric. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in, peaches and rain, and felt the world right itself. They stood there, locked together under the awning, the lantern casting a golden glow around them, the rain a soft hymn to their reunion. I thought I'd lost you, she murmured against his chest. When you pushed me away, I thought that was it. I was wrong, he said, pulling back to look at her, his hands framing her face. Scared, stupid, stuck in the past. But I couldn't let you go. Not really. I saw you on that TV and you looked trapped. I had to try. She smiled, fragile but real. I was trapped. My family, Edward, they wanted a merger, not a marriage. I couldn't do it, not after Willow Creek, not after you. He brushed a thumb across her cheek, wiping away a tear or a raindrop. He couldn't tell. What do you want now? Her gaze steadied, fierce and clear. This, a life that's mine, not hotels or money. Something real. With you, if you'll have me. Always, he said. The word of vow, and he kissed her then, slow and deep, the rain fading to a whisper around them. It wasn't a movie kiss, all flash and drama. It was theirs, raw and true, built on fishing lines and peach cobbler and 1,000 quiet moments. Headlights flared again, and they broke apart, startled, as a car pulled up. A beat-up sedan, not the sleek SUV from before. A man stepped out, tall and broad, his face shadowed under a cap. Isabel tensed, but then he spoke, his voice low and familiar. Izzy? James? She gasped, stepping forward. It was her brother, older by 5 years, the only Monroe who'd ever understood her. He approached, rain glistening on his coat, and nodded at Gideon. You the mechanic she's been hiding with? Gideon squared his shoulders, meeting his gaze. Yeah, Gideon Hale. James studied him, then turned to Isabel. I'm not here to drag you back. Mom and Dad are furious. Edward's a mess, but I saw you run. I've been driving half the night to find you. You're my sister. I want you happy, not chained. Isabel's eyes softened, and she hugged him quick and tight. Thank you. James pulled back, glancing between them. You've got a plan? We will, Gideon said, his arm slipping around Isabel. Starting here. James nodded, a faint smile breaking through. Good. I'll handle the fallout. Take care of her, Hale. He climbed back into his car, the engine rumbling as he drove off, leaving them alone again. Isabel turned to Gideon, her hand finding his. What now? He looked at the garage, the lantern, the life he'd built, and the one they could build, together. We figure it out, day by day. You're home if you want it. I do, she said, and they stood there, the rain easing, the night folding around them like a promise kept. 6 months had passed since the rain-soaked night Isabel Monroe returned to Willow Creek, and the town glowed with the golden hues of early autumn. The leaves on the cottonwoods burned red and amber, carpeting the ground outside Gideon Hale's garage, where a new sign hung above the door, Hale and Monroe Community Works. It wasn't just a garage anymore. It was a lifeline, a place where engines roared back to life and dreams found their footing. Beside it, a small addition gleamed, its windows framed with flower boxes, a cafe reborn from Maggie's old spot, now theirs. Gideon stood in the garage bay, wiping grease from his hands, his broad shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been in years. At 42, he'd spent too long believing love was a luxury he'd lost, but Isabel had changed that. She'd chosen him, chosen this dusty town over a glittering empire, and together they'd built something new. The garage hummed with purpose. Local kids tinkered with old bikes under his watchful eye, their laughter mingling with the clank of tools. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Inside the cafe, Isabel moved with quiet grace, her apron dusted with flour as she slid a tray of peach cobbler into the oven. She'd poured her inheritance into this, sold off shares of the Monroe Empire, kept just enough to seed their dream. And it felt right. No more boardrooms or ballrooms, just the warm chatter of neighbors and the smell of coffee brewing. She'd found her freedom here, not in running away, but in building something real. At 38, she was home. The bell above the cafe door jingled, and Maggie stepped in, her grey hair tied back, a rare smile softening her wiry frame. She carried a letter, her eyes bright. "Got news," she said, handing it to Isabel. "Sarah's coming back next week. Says she wants to meet you. Thank you for pushing me to reach out." Isabel's face lit up, and she hugged Maggie quick and tight. "That's wonderful, Maggie. She'll love it here." Maggie nodded, her voice thick. "Wouldn't have happened without you. You and Gideon, you're good for this town." Gideon joined them, catching the tail end, and Maggie clapped his shoulder. "You two did this. Turned a couple of old wrecks into something worth keeping." He grinned, a rare, full smile. "Takes one to know one, Mags." She swatted him, laughing, and headed out, leaving them alone as the afternoon sun slanted through. The windows. Isabel turned to Gideon, her sea-storm eyes warm. "She's right, you know. We're doing okay." "Better than okay," he said, stepping closer. "We're good." The day faded into dusk, the town settling into its quiet rhythm, and Gideon locked up the garage, his hand finding Isabel's as they walked to the pond. It was their spot now, the place where they'd fished, where he'd first let her in, where she'd run back to him. The water shimmered under a sky streaked with pink, and he pulled her down to the bank, the grass cool beneath them. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, steady. "About us. About this." She tilted her head, curious. "What about it?" He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small ring, simple, forged from steel in his workshop, polished to a soft gleam. "I don't have much to give you. No empire, no fancy life. Just this, me here for as long as you'll have me. Will you marry me, Isabel?" Her breath caught, tears welling as she touched the ring, its edges warm from his hand. "Gideon," she whispered, then laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Yes, yes, I will." He slid it onto her finger, his calloused hands gentle, and she kissed him, slow, deep, a promise sealed under the fading light. "This is my empire now," she murmured against his lips, and he held her close, the weight of her words settling into his bones. The town gathered that weekend, a makeshift celebration spilling from the cafe to the garage. Tables groaned with cobbler and casseroles, string lights twinkled overhead, and a local band strummed a tune that had folks dancing. On the gravel, Maggie toasted them with coffee, her eyes misty as Sarah, tall, quiet, with her mother's sharp gaze, stood beside her, home at last. The Hendersons brought their toddler, the roof fixed thanks to Isabel's gift all those months ago, and old man Tanner even cracked a smile, muttering about the best pie he'd ever had. Gideon pulled Isabel into a dance, his arms steady, around her, and she rested her head on his chest, the rhythm of his heartbeat grounding her. "We did this," she said, looking out at the faces, friends, family now. "All of it." "Yeah," he said, his voice soft. "We did." Later, as the stars blinked awake, they slipped back to the cafe, the last guests trailing off into the night. Isabel paused at the counter, where a framed sketch hung, a pencil drawing of them by the pond, her gift to him from that letter she'd left with Maggie. Below it, in her careful script, a title. "The Road to Love." She'd added it. After the rain, after the choice, after they'd found each other again, Gideon wrapped an arm around her, studying it. "That's us," he said, a quiet awe in his tone. "Right there." "It's more than us," she replied, leaning into him. "It's what we've built, what we'll keep building." The night stretched on, the cafe quiet, save for the hum of the fridge and the rustle of leaves outside. They stood there together, the road behind them paved with kindness and courage, the one ahead wide open with possibility. It wasn't a fairy tale, no castles, no riches, but it was theirs, hard-won and true, a love that didn't need to shout because it lived in every small, steady moment. And as the stars burned bright over Willow Creek, Gideon knew this was enough. This was everything. They'd found their way, not just to each other, but to a life that mattered, a legacy of goodness that would linger long after they were gone. Now that we've reached the end of this unforgettable journey, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I love seeing how stories connect us from all over the world. What was your favorite moment from the story? Did a particular scene resonate with you? Let's talk about it. And if you enjoyed this story and want to see more heartfelt, inspiring love stories, don't forget to like this video. It helps more people discover this story. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story. Turn on notifications, so you're always the first to know when a new episode drops. Thank you so much for being part of this journey. Your support means the world, and I can't wait to share even more incredible stories with you soon. Until next time, stay inspired, keep believing in love, and never stop chasing your own adventure.